Hello everybody, I'm George Larrimore and you are watching Vietnam 360 on the Library Channel. Today we're talking about perhaps the most traumatic moments in the long history of America's involvement in Vietnam. The end of a war that cost the lives of more than 58,000 Americans and more than 1 million Vietnamese. Our guest today is Frank Snepp. Frank served with the Central Intelligence Agency in Vietnam starting in 1969. He was one of the last to leave when Saigon fell in April of 1975. In Vietnam, Frank Snepp was the CIA's chief strategy analyst. He knew what was happening on the ground, as well as inside the circles of power. He debriefed agents, he interrogated prisoners, and the analysis of what he learned often went all the way to the White House. After returning from Vietnam, Frank Snepp was honored by the CIA with the Intelligence Medal of Merit. Later, he wrote Decent Interval, a widely read and respected account of those final days. Frank Snepp believes there are still many lessons to be learned from Vietnam. We talk with him remotely from his home in Los Angeles.
What I say is that there's a lot of revisionism going on. A lot of people are trying to rewrite history. And the best thing is to talk to the eyewitnesses who are still around. There are few of us left. We are passing along very quickly, but the eyewitnesses have it because there is a filter in a lot of hands these days which changes what actually went on. There are people who would like to blame the U.S. Congress for cutting aid to Vietnam. They say that's what sent the country down the drain, the South Vietnamese. There are people on the left who say that the good guys won, the revolutionaries won. That's baloney as well. So I say, first of all, get your facts straight, then line up the lessons. The primary lesson is get to know your friends as well as you know your enemy. Be sure when you engage in any foreign conflict, you know who your allies are. And admit their mistakes, admit their weaknesses, and then proceed accordingly. That's one of the most important lessons of Vietnam I'd like to pass along to other people.
Did you, when the war in Afghanistan happened, did you think about Vietnam? I'm sure you did at the time when we were having so much trouble getting out. Did the parallels there occur to you at the time?
We ignored the corruption, the weaknesses of our own strategy. We were into nation building as in Vietnam, and we made the same mistakes. And it's really horrifying. In fact, Afghanistan, my brother, by the way, served there in a civilian capacity, not an intelligence capacity, so I know a lot about it. Afghanistan is proof that we don't learn from history.
Frank, I want you to, if you don't mind, explain to our audience what your role was in the Vietnam War. Now, you were a C.I.A. analyst analyzing the strategy of the North Vietnamese as it applied to the war against the South. But tell us more about what you did and what your job was and what you did each day.
I was sent to Vietnam in 1969, right after the Tet Offensive. I knew absolutely nothing about the war, hardly knew where Vietnam was, had joined the CIA the year before to stay out of Vietnam. Everybody said, you, Frank, you've been to Columbia University School of International Affairs, studied NATO strategy. You can get a job in the CIA working in European affairs, never have to worry about being drafted and sent to Vietnam. A jokester in my office at the CIA put my name in for a Vietnam assignment without telling me, and lo and behold, I was accepted. And I went through paramilitary training of a modified variety. And in mid-1969, I was sent to Vietnam. I was there continuously almost for the next 6 years. I was one of the last people to be airlifted off the roof of the U.S. Embassy. My job initially was very modest. Analysts were not thought of very highly in Vietnam, the CIA station. I belonged to a small unit that had been created in 1964 by the CIA station chief at the time, Pierre de Silva, and he wanted to be able to develop finished intelligence on the ground, mainly to be able to kill people more efficiently in the Phoenix program and such operations. So I was plugged into this unit knowing nothing about Vietnam. The station chief at the time, Theodore Shackley, who was a legend in the CIA, thought that I probably would fit into an inconsequential role very nicely as the analyst of North Vietnam strategy. I didn't know anything about this, but I was plugged in, and immediately I was given access to all the intelligence of a substantive nature. If you wondered what was going on in Vietnam, I had access to that intelligence. That remained my brevet to the end of the war. And because I had access to our top agents, in fact, began interacting directly with the two of them that we had, I was hugely well informed about the enemy. Not because I was smart, I couldn't even speak Vietnamese, but because I had access, because of this job, this accidental assignment, I had access to all the intelligence. What that meant was I prepared analyses for the ambassador, I briefed visiting congressmen, you name it, and I was drawn increasingly into operations because in the field, the CIA operative in the field was not given access to high-level intelligence, even if he was managing an important agent, a Vietnamese agent. Because if he was captured, that is to say, the CIA case officer, he would have all these secrets in his head and he could give them up. I was brought in to do the granular interrogations. I became a very successful interrogator. I interrogated the highest ranking prisoner we ever captured. I did this for about 6 months, right prior to the ceasefire. I dealt with all the ambassadors. I was finally the chief briefer for the ambassadors in Vietnam. I wrote all the CIA station chiefs' primary analyses. And most importantly, for my experience and perspectives, I was given direct access to our two best agents, one in Hanoi. His existence, this agent's bona fides, his identity, all still secret, all still secret. Simultaneously, I had access to our best Vietnamese agent inside the Communist Command, a person whose name was Vo Van Ba. And so ultimately, I wound up in the strangest situation, George. Though I had no experience, no language skills, no nothing, I had access to these great sources of intelligence. I was in a position to cross-check what our two best agents told us in real time. I would talk to the agent in Hanoi. I'd meet him in safe houses inside Vietnam and out. And then I could go from him and talk directly to our best agent inside the Communist Command, Vo Van Ba. I was the only CIA operative in Vietnam ever simultaneously access to our two best sources. It doesn't get any better than that in the intelligence business. Caveat, important. I was totally ill-equipped to do this. I was not smart. I was not in any way accomplished. It was an accident that I fell into this position. But because of that, I was able and am able today to provide perspectives that other people who were in Vietnam, who were doing incredibly important work, aren't able to do because I had access to the sources of information that mattered.
You mentioned, I was going to ask you about Vo Van Ba. You had a lot of respect for him. Can you explain that to us? Because he's essentially the enemy. But of course, it's your job to interrogate him and understand and find out what he knows. But you had a lot of respect for the way that he managed himself.
Well, let me tell you about Vo Van Ba very quickly. Vo Van Ba had been a communist, a youth organizer in the late 1940s, the beginning of the revolution, if you will. He soured on the communists because they used too much terror and murder to win hearts and minds. So he quit them. And he went to live in Tay Ninh province. He was a slash and burn farmer. And he was very happily working there for years and years and years until the South Vietnamese police in the province realized that his farm sat athwart all the ingress and egress routes to the Communist Command for the Saigon area and the Delta. It was known as Cosvin. The central office sat on Black Virgin Mountain just down the road from his farm. And every time Major Cadre went to Cosvin, this Communist Command, he talked to him. They found out that he'd been a communist, and they wanted him to rejoin them. The South Vietnamese police learned this. They doubled him. They persuaded him to volunteer to work with the communists, pretending to be a born-again revolutionary. And he was to report everything he learned to us. After the war, the communists evaluated this agent's intelligence because they were so surprised that somebody had been able to second guess them all along. And they published their findings and revealed that Vo Van Ba, this born-again revolutionary or posing as a born-again revolutionary, had stolen every one of their secrets from 1965 to the end of the war. I dealt directly with this guy. He was like having a spy in Hitler's bunker. He was that good. Let me tell you about this guy. He had a photographic memory. He gained the communist confidence to the extent that he sat in on their primary strategy meetings at Cosvin, up on Black Virgin Mountain. And then he would bring what he learned to his Vietnamese police case officer and then to me, and he had a wonderful C.I.A. case, very brave C.I.A. case officer. I would sit in and debrief the case officer and Vo Van Ba. Now, Vo Van Ba was an old guy when I met with him. He was wizened, he was thin, his eyes darted constantly as if he was always looking for somebody who might jump him. I would be nervous as hell. But this guy could look at a piece of paper, a communist planning document, and then come back and recite it back to you. If you're trying to hire a spy, that's what you want. The photographic memory. And he loved Budweiser beer. When he'd come to a safe house to meet with me, he would first demand a Budweiser, swig it down, then he'd demand a Salem cigarette, because Ho Chi Minh loved Salem cigarettes. And Vo Van Ba, as sort of his own personal joke, would light up the Salem, pretending to imbibe, if you will, Ho Chi Minh. And then he would unload what he had learned at Cosvin. And by the communists' own account, post-war accounts, he had the gold. He gave us everything. He predicted the Tet Offensive, despite what people think. He gave us 5 days warning of it. He gave us all the intelligence we needed on the Paris Peace Accords and Henry Kissinger's secret negotiations with late Octo, because the communists were briefed on these secret talks between Kissinger and late Octo. Vo Van Ba would listen in, then he'd come tell the C.I.A. what Kissinger was doing. It was the most extraordinary thing. And he also predicted right down to the last cannonball what the communists were going to do at the end of the war. This guy, because of his intelligence, saved hundreds of thousands of American lives and Vietnamese lives in the course of the war, from 65 to the end. Until I began talking about him, nobody knew he existed, because his entire career was totally classified. But when the North Vietnamese, after the war, began publishing their own record of his accomplishments, we could begin talking about it. So he was extremely important. Now, spy in Hanoi we had, his profile is still deeply classified. But this guy, the guy in Hanoi, was so well plugged in, he could give us the mirror image of what Vo Van Ba was picking up inside the Communist Command in the South.
A confirmation.
Extraordinary.
It's a confirmation, right?
Not only confirmation, he could provide embroidery. For instance, guy in Hanoi, I meet with him, I say, look, we want to know what the communists are going to do this next dry season. Are they going to infiltrate more people into the South? Our guy in Hanoi would go around to the hospitals in Hanoi and the surroundings, open the garbage lids, and look to see if there are hypodermic needles there. And if there were lots of them, that meant the communists were inoculating troops to send south. And that was confirmation that in the next dry season infiltration period, the communists would be sending lots of people south. So he could confirm what Vauvenbach told us based on his debriefing of the communists. Our guy in Hanoi could tell us, or could give us confirmation, these were not Viet Cong. These were not pajama-clad revolutionaries. These were members of an invading force that went into the South to try to capture a Vietnamese neighbor. That's what this war finally evolved into. And when the war ended, that's what was going on. We were looking at a Westphalian situation, one sovereign nation invading another. And all these people who boastively say the revolutionaries won, baloney. There were no revolutionaries after Tet 68. They were all killed off. The people who waged the war were main force units infiltrating down the Ho Chi Minh Trail system into the South.
You mentioned there are a couple of things I want to remember that you've written in your book, Decent Interval, which is a marvelous book, a really remarkable book about particularly the final days of the war. You mentioned intelligence is power.
We had the waterfront covered in Vietnam in terms of intelligence. There was very little that surprised us, particularly in the period from 1969 to the end. 1969 was when Vietnamization was put into effect. Richard Nixon wanted to get out of Vietnam. He began withdrawing forces. This was after the Tet Offensive. We had a very good idea of the kind of inroads the communists were making in the countryside. We had a very good idea of what corruption looked like among our own allies, which was the rot that was destroying Saigon's capacity to fight. We would report the first variety of the intelligence. We would not report the second part because American officials didn't want to admit to themselves that we were backing a problematic cause. Everything depended on putting lipstick on the pig, covering up the blemishes of our allies, because only that way could we persuade Congress to continue providing aid. And there was so much anti-war sentiment in the United States. Everybody was looking for some reason not to help the South Vietnamese. And so the flow of information on what was happening inside the South Vietnamese government and inside the South Vietnamese army dried up. For instance, the corruption was rampant in the South Vietnamese bureaucracies, not because they were bad. It was because we had poured millions of dollars into an underdeveloped economy. The money pooled in cities, that disrupted the entire economy, black markets grew up and so forth. By the end of the war, corruption was so bad. Number one, the South Vietnamese, our own defense attaché in Saigon, could not even determine how large the South Vietnamese army was, because there were so many desertions, so many ghost soldiers, so many absentees that were counted as being on the books for corruption reasons. Our attaché couldn't tell how many allies we had. That's extraordinary.
That bedeviled us all the way to the end.
Yes, it did. We were unwilling to admit that we had a problem on our hands. And when the last ambassador to Saigon, Graham Martin, arrived, he told us in the embassy, he said, "Gentlemen, we will not engage in any proctologic examinations of the South Vietnamese polity." And what that meant was, like his predecessors, he was allergic to any bad news about the South Vietnamese, because that made it more difficult to get Congress to back the South Vietnamese. So basically, we were told to blind ourselves. We imposed in the intelligence business, in a CIA station, what were known as fecal filters that basically eliminated, using very high reporting standards, any bad news. If you had a piece of bad news to report, you had to meet these quality reporting standards. It was so high, it never got disseminated. So we blinded ourselves with these blinkers on with respect to our allies, even as we had extraordinary intelligence on the enemy.
But this information is going to the highest levels of the American government. So if you're getting partial information, you're getting incorrect information. I don't mean to simplify it like that, but it seems like that's the way it is. But you were speaking to essentially the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the head of the head of the American embassy there. So you're speaking to the very highest level of the American government and giving them the information they need to make decisions on, and you're being prevented from doing that.
That's correct. Now, to be very clear, the station had terrific people working for it, the CIA station, so did the embassy. And these people were often guys with great integrity. But we did not have encouragement. We did not have the clearance in the system to send bad news back to Washington. And my job was particularly fraught because my job was to send the truth up the chain of command. I briefed the ambassadors, I briefed visitors, senators, congressmen, what have you. And I had to use euphemisms to get even a glimpse of some of the worst of the news across to them. And towards the end of the war, I became so concerned that I began leaking to the press, committing the cardinal sin, because I was so concerned that we would be blinded in Washington and that we'd wind up inadvertently adding to the problems for our South Vietnamese allies. What I had to do was to make a devil's bargain, to stay in play, to remain relevant, to remain in my position. I had to bite my tongue often and suppress information I wanted to give to a senator, to a congressman, you name it, somebody who could do something with it. I leaked to the press, as I said, at the times that I thought that was the only way to get things, the intelligence to Washington. But it was always a moral dilemma. And you get into a situation when you're positioned as I was, you say to yourself, well, maybe today I'll just keep my mouth shut. I won't tell the senator or the congressman what I really know is happening on the ground. And if I do that, I'll accumulate this political credit with the ambassador, and I'll gain enough clout tomorrow to make a difference. The problem is a place like Vietnam, tomorrow never comes. You keep postponing that moment when you'll stand up and say, damn it, this is the truth, listen to it.
The moment of reckoning came, I guess, as early as March of 1975, or perhaps earlier than that, but March and April of 1975 when it galloped to a conclusion. If you would, because that's such a riveting part of the story that you tell in your book, Decent Interval, tell us what it felt like in Saigon in, let's say, mid-March of 1975. The war ended on April 30th, 1975. But tell us how it felt in those days, because I know you had allegiances to Vietnamese people who had worked for you, whom you had worked with, and who trusted you and you trusted them. And you're trying to take care of those people too, as well as the Americans who are still there and involved with the war. Tell us about those days, what it felt like, what you felt like trying to deal with everything that you just explained.
Okay, let me set the stage for you. In 1973, Kissinger and Nixon arranged a ceasefire in Vietnam. It left 140,000 North Vietnamese in the South in the South, sitting on the ground, because we'd never beaten them, so we couldn't negotiate them out of Vietnam. So as the ceasefire developed, the enemy was literally on the doorstep. The North Vietnamese, who'd been playing it safe because of Kissinger's opening to China, they were getting less aid from Chinese and the Russians. They were playing it safe, but when Nixon resigned, the North Vietnamese said to themselves, we're going to go for broke. We'll start testing. They did. They began punching around, looking for soft spots in the South Vietnamese defenses. They captured an entire province in January 1975. First time they'd done that since 72. Nobody reacted. The American administration didn't react, and Thieu didn't react. He was waiting for us to react. When they seized that province, just north of Saigon, early 75, the Hanoi leadership decided the road to Saigon was open, and they began throwing forces into the South pell-mell. Because President Thieu had misidentified what he thought the communists were going to do, and so had the C.I.A. at this point, the communists were able to surprise us. The communists took advantage of the chaos, and within a month, the month of March, they seized the entire northern half of South Vietnam and routed half of the South Vietnamese army. At the time, Graham Martin, the ambassador, was in Washington trying to get aid for the South Vietnamese. And when he arrived back in Saigon in early April, after this chaotic and disastrous month in which the entire war had changed profile, the South Vietnamese were on their backside. The communists were on the move everywhere. We had 500,000 refugees heading towards Saigon from the war-torn areas to the north that had just fallen to the communists. We had 1,200 Americans doing nothing because they lost their jobs up country when the communists seized this territory. Martin comes back. I'm sent to brief him by the CIA station chief, Tom Polgar. I go into Martin's office. I'm his chief briefer, and I had all my charts, and I said, Mr. Ambassador, the communists have turned Cambodia into a parking lot. They have taken the northern part of the country. Half of the army is unaccounted for. I've seen the South Vietnamese troops escaping into the sea, and we're in a desperate situation, sir. He looked at me, and he was a North Carolinian like me. He said, Frank, I have better intelligence. I was stunned. This man had been in Washington for the past month. He had gotten it into his head that despite this crisis that we were facing, he could get Kissinger to persuade the Soviets and the Chinese, for their own interests, to pull the reins on the North Vietnamese and save the day.
He still thought there could be a negotiated settlement.
He thought that he could snatch victory from defeat. He thought the Soviets and the Chinese would intervene with the North Vietnamese. I met with our agent from Hanoi. The agent told me the communists are on a blood scent. They will seize Saigon at the earliest possible opportunity. That information was so startling, and several high-ranking officials, including Polgar himself, my boss, were sitting in on the debrief. Because of that debrief, one of the C.I.A. officials had the foresight to ask the South Vietnamese to set up roadblocks around Saigon to keep the 500,000 refugees heading for the city from pouring into the city. That move spared us all sorts of grief. Had those refugees entered the city, we would have been paralyzed from that moment on. So that piece of intelligence is very important. But the ambassador wouldn't believe that we were in terrible trouble. He kept thinking that Thieu could rally the army. There was no army anymore. There was no command and control. But Martin convinced himself if only Thieu could just hold the line, he could create a defensive enclave in the southern part of the country. The Soviets and the Chinese would step in. Everybody would be happy. Take care of business, okay? And he wouldn't plan for an evacuation because that would create chaos that might undermine all of this. Well, I was crazed because I knew what was going to happen. I was told by my boss, Tom Polgard, to analyze how many Vietnamese we would have to save in an emergency. Polgar was very pessimistic, and the reason he asked me to do this, he thought I'd come up with a figure so terrible it would cause Washington to get sober and to begin looking at the situation a little more realistically. I came up with a figure 1 million. We would have to evacuate 1 million people to do our moral duty to the South Vietnamese who had worked with us. That was impossible. It was a nightmare. I went to Martin at one point. I said, "Sir, we are facing an evacuation problem of mammoth proportions. Let's send some of our people down to the coast right now so that they could be lifted off the beaches in an emergency." He said, "No, Frank, that would cause chaos and inhibit the South Vietnamese from defending themselves." Okay, we are now mid-April. We're in this crazy situation. Nobody's preparing for an evacuation. Nobody's leaving. No Americans. There are about 1,200, maybe a few more, still there. They're not leaving. All of them have girlfriends, Vietnamese friends, and whatever. They're not going to leave. But President Thieu would not ease up visa restrictions for fear of causing chaos in the city. Martin would not intervene with Washington to ease up immigration restrictions allowing Vietnamese to go into the United States. So there was no way to get anybody, even begin to smuggle people onto aircraft to get them out of the country. And Martin refused to set up an evacuation overland to the beaches. So we were stalled. Then we hit a crisis. Oh my God. On April 12th, mid-month, 2 weeks out from the end, Cambodia falls. The communists seize Phnom Penh. There's a modest evacuation. About 100 people are evacuated by the American troops that are operating from the naval fleet offshore. It was a modest evacuation, very successful, but it revealed by its modesty what a terrible challenge we faced with 1 million Vietnamese. A few days later, our northern defense line, 40 miles out north of Saigon, began collapsing. NVA began moving towards Saigon. 40 miles out. There are about 240,000 North Vietnamese moving towards Saigon. At this particular point, Polgar was getting extremely concerned. He was hearing from Hungarian diplomatic contacts, French contacts. If we just got rid of Thieu, the communists would negotiate. And Martin had asked Kissinger to reach out to the Soviets to intervene with Hanoi. So we had all this turbulence. Polgar came to me and he said, "I want you to draw up an estimate of how many people in Saigon, how many South Vietnamese officials are planning to overthrow Nguyen Van Thieu." There was so much turbulence. So I did this. He took the study to Martin. He said, "Look, Mr. Ambassador, we got to do something because we have all these coup makers, Nguyen Cao Ky, rivals of Thieu, all preparing to overthrow Thieu himself." Martin decided at that moment, reading this, that indeed we had to get rid of Nguyen Van Thieu, believing that this would bring on peace. Okay? And he asked me, he said, "Draw up a worst case scenario, a prospectus that I can use to persuade Thieu his days are numbered." I did this. The defense attaché contributed to it. Martin took this document to Nguyen Van Thieu, and Thieu decided as of mid-April, again 2 weeks from the end, that he would step down. It was a hopeless situation. Rather than being encouraged by this, I was horrified because I thought, well, now Martin and Polgar will decide the situation is copacetic. They won't plan for an evacuation. So I decided to call Vo Van Ba in out of the field, our agent inside the Communist Command, to double check to see what he knew was going to happen, what the communists were going to do. He came into Saigon dressed as an old woman, had a black wig on, garbo glasses. He came into the safe house. He took off his disguise, drank his Budweiser, smoked a Salem cigarette, and then he unloaded. He said, the communists are planning to be in Saigon by late April so that they can celebrate Ho Chi Minh's birthday here. They will launch their final attack with airstrikes and with a major bombardment. There is absolutely no chance of a negotiated settlement. If Nguyen Van Thieu goes, that will make no difference to them. I asked him specifically, if Thieu goes, will that make any difference? He said, nope, they'll be in Saigon by the beginning of May. That's just a few weeks away. I ran back to the ambassador and Polgar, station chief, gave them this information. They said, we're not going to disseminate this intelligence. I said, what? What are you talking about? Not quite that extreme. Both of them were convinced that Kissinger would weigh in with good news from Hanoi. They thought this intelligence was out of date. I said, let me send it back through operational channels. Just so if we're wrong, we're not going to look like, we suppress this intelligence.
At least someone saw it, yeah.
I sent it back, and it so upset Noel Geiler, Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Forces for the Pacific, that he called the station that night and said, is this to be believed? And Polgar had to admit to him, he said, yeah, well, that's our latest intelligence. Geiler came to Saigon that weekend to begin planning for a helicopter evacuation. Had not he done that, had not Vo Van Ba given us this intelligence, we wouldn't have had a helicopter airlift in the end. On April 21st, Thieu delivered his swan song, went on television, said, I'm stepping down. The Americans have betrayed me. Henry Kissinger stabbed me in the back, blah, blah, blah. Martin and Polgar thought that would solve it. It didn't. The communists kept moving. 4 days after Thieu resigns, Martin calls me and he says, Frank, I have a job for you. I want you to be Thieu's escort tonight. I said, what? Finally, Thieu had decided to leave the country. The South Vietnamese acting president, Thieu's vice president, had insisted that Thieu leave. He felt the communists would never negotiate if Thieu was still in town. So that night, I drove Nguyen Van Thieu, I was his chauffeur, to a blacked out spot at Tan Son Nhut Air Base to be evacuated. And it was one of the most terrifying assignments I've ever had, because everybody was gunning for Thieu that night. The Viet Cong, the communists from Hanoi, Nguyen Cao Ky, rivals of Thieu. There were any number of people who were going to, if they could get their hands on him, would tear his head off. And Thieu got in the car, and in the back seat was a C.I.A. guy named Charles Timmis. General Timmis, a retired guy, old friend of Thieu's. And Timmis introduced me as a high-class chauffeur. And Thieu said something like, oh, the traffic in Saigon is so bad. The traffic didn't exist that night. It was totally blacked out. There was a curfew. There were nobody on the street except armed troops and the Viet Cong somewhere. Well, we managed to get to Tan Son Nhut without incident, although it was very scary. And Thieu was reminiscing about the great times he and this General Timmis had in MR1 way back in the early 1960s. It was surreal. We reached the part of the Tan Son Nhut Air Base. It was totally blacked out. The Thieu was to catch his aircraft. And I doused my lights. And I almost ran over the C.I.A. station chief because I couldn't see anything. We reached the aircraft that was to take Thieu to Taiwan, out of the country. And Chew reaches over the seat and he said, he'd been weeping, and he said, "Thank you for everything." And I had the strangest sensation. I don't mean to be smiling about it, but because it was horrifying. And it was a very sad moment. But when he said that, I thought, what are you thanking me for? I got you to the airport. Is it the 58,000 American guys who died? What is it for? And he didn't, I didn't pose that question. He got out. He and his prime minister raced up the aircraft, and they were ready to take off. Martin, who was there looking like a professor in his gray suit and his horn-rimmed glasses, he grabs the loading ramp to the aircraft and begins dragging away. This is the ambassador of the United States dragging away. And it was as if he were trying to rip us finally away from our commitment to Vietnam. They were, Chew had taken some gold with him. I had detected the sound of gold in his suitcase, clink, 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 clink. And that was it. Everybody thought that would change everything. It didn't. It didn't. 4 days later, the communists attacked Saigon with captured aircraft, just as Vo Van Dort had said. There were no negotiations. And on the final day, I was blown out of bed as the communists began shelling Tanzania Air Base. I raced to the embassy. I spent the entire morning trying to get our Air America helicopters out into the field so they could pick people up. Somebody had screwed up, not coordinated Greenwich Mean Time with Saigon time. So the big helicopters from the fleet didn't begin arriving until afternoon. The only evacuation that morning was handled by C.I.A.'s Air America helicopters. I was deeply involved in sending the choppers to pick people up. Pogar's girlfriend, station chief's girlfriend, had been left outside the embassy, and he spent much of his time that morning trying to get her in over the walls of the embassy. I was moving the choppers to where they were supposed to be from time to time, going down to the embassy wall to try to haul people over. It was a nightmare. We had not destroyed all of our classified documents. We were throwing them into the incinerators on the roof of the embassy. The building was shaking like this. There was soot all over the place. We'd take bags of half shredded classified garbage. We'd put them in the yard to await destruction. And when the choppers finally, in mid-afternoon, the big choppers began landing in the courtyard, the downdress blew open all this classified confetti, and it went all over the trees. So when the North Vietnamese arrived, they just scotch taped together our secrets. That's how chaotic it was the last day.
Frank, I know that there were a lot of a lot of Vietnamese people who were employed by the government, employed by American news agencies there. So they're people who had relationships with Americans and trusted the Americans. And I know this hurt you to see a lot of those people unable to get out of the country at the time. Can you talk with us about that? Because I want to talk about kind of where you are today, all these years later, and how you think about that time.
We had a list of very high ranking, very sensitive Vietnamese, meaning people who had access to our secrets. There were about 6,000 of them. We didn't get any of them out. What happened during the final days when everybody was racing to the choppers, Americans were evacuating girlfriends, maids, and what have you. The last month of the war, we got out 60,000 Vietnamese and third country nationals. The high risk Vietnamese, all of our translators, there were 70 of them, Vietnamese translators, who had dealt with all of our agents, they didn't get out. And in the process, a Vietnamese girlfriend, I was so busy the last weeks of the war, touching so many bases. I hadn't slept, I don't think, more than a few hours in 3 weeks. I was like the guy in the movie Insomnia. I was staggering around. I was so tired. I had a old Vietnamese girlfriend who turned up. I hadn't seen her in a year or so. She showed up with what she said, with an American baby, with a mixed race baby. Many Vietnamese were showing up with mixed race babies and saying to an American in the embassy, "This is yours, get us out." This woman did this to me. I was so busy, I couldn't get her out in the moment. And I said, "Look," this was 2 or 3 days before the end, I said, "I will get you out." I don't know. I was skeptical that this child was mine, but I was helping anybody I could. And she said, "If you don't get me out, I'll kill myself and the child." And I said, "I'll get you out. Just call this number in an emergency in a couple of days. I'll make it happen." She called. I missed her. And from all information I later gathered, she killed herself and that child. That was emblematic of what happened to a lot of Americans those last days. They couldn't get the Vietnamese out they should have. They postponed moral responsibilities in deference to what seemed to be the official priority of the moment. That's happened to me. I've thought in retrospect, why didn't I just say to the ambassador, "I've had it. I've done everything I can. I'm now taking care of the Vietnamese who are closest to me." I didn't do that. And I live with that on my conscience every day of my life. I made the wrong choice. I made the choice that many Americans made in Vietnam, which was to put the official business ahead of concerns for the humanitarian issues that we had to confront. And so I was not unique. I'm just one of these people who was left with the guilt. And mine was particularly acute because I had access to intelligence, which told us enough to enable us to arrange an orderly evacuation. And it didn't happen for a variety of reasons. I tried to get everybody to pay attention to what Vo Van Ba and the agent in Hanoi were telling us. It didn't make any difference. What happened to Vo Van Ba? What happened to Vo Van Ba? After meeting with me, he decided not to leave. He would stay behind. He said, "The country that I've served so long, I'm going to stay with." He was betrayed to the communists by a captured C.I.A. employee. The employee was tortured, gave up Vo Van Ba's name about 2 weeks before the end. I didn't know this. After the Americans left, the communists captured him, tortured him. He gave up no secrets. Instead, he hung himself by his belt. So we couldn't even get out of the country the Vietnamese who had served us so well. He killed himself rather than give up our last secrets. So I'm haunted by the thought that I wasn't able to get this woman and her child out. I'm haunted that I didn't grab the ambassador by the collar and say, "Sir, you gotta do something." I was too polite to do it. Always the good soldier. And Vo Van Ba, who had saved, as I say, hundreds of thousands of American lives and Vietnamese lives in the course of the war, died, betrayed by a CIA officer under torture.
Is it fair to say that the American government betrayed the Vietnamese who helped us? Is that too strong a word?
Betrayal is the wrong word. 58,000 brave Americans died to save South Vietnam. And the problem is the war was so controversial. Those soldiers were never honored for their service. It looked like the war was tainted. We didn't betray the South Vietnamese. We betrayed the truth. Too often we let wishful thinking get in the way of intelligence that could have changed the outcome, modified the worst possible scenario. That was our issue. But it would be wrong to say betray, because that would mean that the Americans had died for nothing. I will say, after the war, no one wanted to do any postmortems to learn anything from what had gone wrong, because the fear was we would discover that Americans had died in vain, that the war had never been waged the right way. Waged the right way? We should have Vietnamized the war in 1965. We should never have sent American troops there. We should have given the South Vietnamese the wherewithal to fight their own war from the very beginning. Not until 1968 were South Vietnamese troops given M16s. Vietnamization didn't begin until 1969. That was stupid. You gotta let the guys on the ground who are defending, whose country it is, defend it. We made those mistakes. Did we betray the South Vietnamese? The problem was, in the end, corruption was so rampant in Vietnam because of the American dollar. So rampant, the South Vietnamese couldn't have absorbed any aid and deployed it effectively, even if we'd given it to them. They lost all the aid that we gave them after the ceasefire, siphoned off onto the black market. This we know because the General Accounting Office of the United States conducted a study in early April 75, 1 month before the end, and determined the South Vietnamese had lost all the aid we'd given them. Been siphoned off onto the black market, misplaced. So we couldn't have given them any aid. All these people, particularly conservatives, who say, look, Congress betrayed, these Democrats in Congress betrayed the South Vietnamese by not voting enough aid. Friends, the fact is, we'd mismanaged the war to such an extent the South Vietnamese couldn't have absorbed aid if we'd provided it and deployed it effectively. That was where the betrayal occurred. Know your friends as well as you know the enemy. We knew the enemy well, but we blinded ourselves to the weaknesses of our allies. Many of those weaknesses we inflicted on them because we threw money and money and money at them without any sense of accountability.
Frank, I'll let you go in a minute, but let me just ask you one last thing. This has been a long time for everybody. Is there still, how do you deal with it today? Do you still think about, I mean, you're still teaching. Obviously, it comes up in the classroom. Obviously, people still want to talk with you. You're still writing about it. How do you deal with your feelings about all of this stuff, all this time later?
I replay the tape all the time because now I have another moral obligation. I'm one of the few living survivors that can tell the story. They're all dying off, all my colleagues. I see Frank Snepp, a very dear old friend of mine who served. He's 86. He and I have vowed to talk and deliver lectures, to talk to these young scholars who are writing about Vietnam, to try to get the truth out. We're still, he and I, my friend, Frank Snepp, we're still trying to do our duty because now we are among the few remaining people around. Lots of soldiers who served in Vietnam still alive, but they didn't see what some of us saw. And so I view it as a moral obligation to try to get the truth out, just what I was trying to do during the war, so that we won't make the same mistakes again. I write all the time. I draw parallels between current American policy and Vietnam, Afghanistan, what we've done with Maduro in Venezuela, the lack of accountability, and the overreach by the executive branch. All of these things contributed to what went wrong in Vietnam. Don't forget, we lied our way into Vietnam. A Democratic president Lyndon Johnson lied his way in Vietnam. So we have to be very careful when we complain about Trump's lies getting us into problems, because Democratic presidents did, a Democratic president did in Vietnam, got us into problems by lying.
You mentioned when we started, these young historians that you're talking to are trying to rewrite history, or to some extent. What does it concern you, the story that they are trying to tell? What story is it that they want to tell?
Many of them are replaying the old anti-war tropes, that the communists were the noble souls, that they owned virtue in Vietnam. This was simply a civil war. Nonsense. It was one from 1954 to the end. It was one sovereign nation invading another. You want an analogy? Ukraine. Ukrainians and the Russians share blood and heritage. No one would say that Putin deserves to own Ukraine because of that. The North Vietnamese didn't deserve to own the South. So we have to put aside some of these old anti-war myths. And the anti-war people, bless their hearts, performed a very important service, helped us get out. But they pretended that virtue was on their side. No, it wasn't. It was a very complicated situation. And rather than point fingers at some of the people who got us into Vietnam, you have to put your head where they were. And to deal with the people who got us in, the thinking that got us in a rational way, in a contextualized way, against the backdrop of the times. That's the way we avoid another Vietnam, by looking at history properly and contextualizing it and trying to understand how people made mistakes. And that's what some of us are trying to do in a very modest and feeble way.
Well, I would say the way that you're trying to do it is not a modest way. And I hope you keep writing, and I hope you keep talking, because you have so much to tell. And I want to thank you again for being here today. We really appreciate your time and your insight. And it's really nice to see you.
Terrific seeing you, George. Take care.
You're watching the Library Channel, a broadcast service of the Memphis Public Libraries and the City of Memphis.